his role as a leader of the methods workstream within the EU Business and Biodiversity Platform since 2017 and his involvement in several ongoing initiatives in that space. Today, Johan will kick off this webinar with a presentation on the importance of biodiversity. Our next speaker is Tom van den Berge. Tom studied philosophy at KU Leuven University and is currently Director of Sustainable Finance at the Belgian Financial Sector Federation Febelfin. In that capacity, he is active in the EU Sustainable Finance legislation, ESG data collection, sustainable investing and ESG integration, and ESG risk management. Tom is also Managing Director at the non-profit Central Labeling Agency that awards the Towards Sustainability label to sustainable investment funds. In this webinar, Tom will discuss on the financial risks and EU regulations upcoming. And for our final presentation, Johan again will share insights on how to measure, assess, reduce, restore, and compensate for biodiversity loss. If you have any questions during this webinar that are directed to the speakers or to me, feel free to write them down in the Q&A box. When all presentations are finished, we will go over your questions. So just so you know, this session is being recorded and will be made available online after today. Johan, I am pleased to give you the floor to begin the first presentation on the importance of biodiversity.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kim. So my name is Johan Lammerand, working for Arcadis since now about 15 years, I think, yes. So we have now today this webinar about biodiversity in the finance sector, because we see that today, and this is happening since a few years now, there's really a momentum amongst businesses and financial institutions, but also amongst governments about the importance of biodiversity. So it's our next crisis. It's often said after the climate crisis, we have the biodiversity crisis, and some do think that this crisis is even bigger than the climate crisis. So the state maybe starting shortly with a few words about the state of the planet. I don't go into the details because I think you are aware, or the majority of those who are joining is aware, that the state of the planet is not very nice at this moment anymore. It's also a bit logic given the rising population with continuously less space for each of us, continuously more consumption, production, and of course this has detrimental impacts on biodiversity. There are reports describing in very detailed ways the decline of all kinds of species populations, and this is happening very rapidly. Next slide, Kim. This is also presented in some graphics, like for instance this one. This is the famous Planetary Boundary graphic, which shows the level of exceedance of the carrying capacity of the planet for a number of topics. And you see that for biodiversity, which is in the upper left corner, that we are already in the red zone. And this is due to the fact that the speed of decline of species diversity is faster than ever before over time. So we need to act very urgently. Next slide. Fortunately, there is a general recognition about the problem, and this graph is from the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum is publishing each year a risk report, a global risk report, based on a survey amongst more than 1,000 influential people all over the world, amongst which many business leaders, but also academia and so on. And they are ranking potential risks to humanity and to society based on the likelihood and the impact. And what we see over the last 10 years is that apart from climate risks, of course, that biodiversity loss is continuously going more to the upper right corner. And this is observed every year. So it is recognized as an important risk for society. Next slide. I thought this was useful for you to show also. This is the famous SDG Wedding Cake, the Sustainable Development Goals. Very often it's presented in a square with the different goals next to one another. But this one is showing very clearly that the Sustainable Development Goals, referring to natural capital, so the living environment, that these are really underpinning for social welfare and economical welfare. So two of these SDGs are number 14 and number 15. 14 referring to life underwater, meaning the marine environment, and 15 referring to terrestrial life. Yes, next slide. This slide is maybe useful to show you how biodiversity is influencing, or how biodiversity is important for you as a business, for you as a financial institution, and for society as a whole. So the concept is based on the concept of natural capital, which consists of stocks, the stocks of the capital itself, the soil, the water, the air, which is underpinned by biodiversity and the living part of nature. And this is together, these ecosystems, in fact, comprised of biodiversity and then the abiotic elements like water and air and soil, is generating a flow of services to society, which are called ecosystem services. These are for free, and these are generating value to society, benefits to businesses, benefits to all of us. But they are not always considered as something very important. They are taken for granted, and this is often the problem. This picture comes from the Natural Capital Protocol, which was compiled in 2016 and provides an international framework for identifying, measuring and valuing your impacts and dependencies on natural capital. Next slide. On ecosystem services, so the benefits and the flows of services which are providing benefits to society, you have different categories. You have the so-called provisioning services like drinking water, like food, like timber, and so on. You have the regulating services like soil erosion control, coastal protection, pollination, carbon sequestration, and so on. And you have then the third group, which are the cultural services, which are providing value to society in the form of recreational values and so on. So businesses have impacts on ecosystems, on natural capital, but they are also dependent on natural capital, on ecosystems, and so on biodiversity. And this is important to understand this dual relationship. Yes, next slide. This is another picture from the Natural Capital Protocol, which shows that businesses, on the left here, that they have impacts on ecosystems. Also society has impacts on ecosystems, but they are also dependent on them. That's clear. Now, healthy ecosystems are providing benefits to businesses, to society, while degraded ecosystems are generating more and more costs to businesses and to societies, because businesses are suffering damage due to the fact that ecosystems are getting degraded. They have, for instance, more difficulties to extract groundwater and so on. And this on its turn generates risks, business risks, but also opportunities, of course, opportunities in the form of ecosystem restoration. And in this picture, the finance sector is depicted here too, because of course, if businesses are impacted, then of course the finance sector. Okay, next slide. This slide is about the different types of risks you have from the perspective of a business. You have, of course, operational risks, as I said, related to ecosystem degradation. You have financial risks due to the fact that indeed more and more financial institutions are looking to the biodiversity performance of companies, and that they are getting more careful with granting loans and so on to businesses who are performing badly with regard to natural capital. There are regulatory risks and so on, and there are also, of course, stakeholder-related risks like reputational risks and so on. So this altogether makes the business case for natural capital and biodiversity, which also applies to the finance sector. And then a few final slides for this introductory session on the future. So historically, we come from a period, and this is still going on, with a continuous decline in biodiversity. And this is going, as I said, this is going very rapidly now. But of course, we have all opportunities to bend the curve. Bending the curve is an important policy tendency at this moment amongst many stakeholders. And of course, it depends on the efforts that you take. So there are different future scenarios. And of course, we all want to restore biodiversity as much as possible by joint action, meaning not only increased conservation efforts, which is important on its own, but also more sustainable production, more sustainable consumption. And on the more sustainable production side, of course, you as a financial institution, you have many possibilities. And this translates into the global goal for nature, which is then on the next slide, where you have a clear picture of the decade of the truth. Today we are in the decade of the truth. We need to try to bend the curve between 2020 and 2030 to be net positive as much as possible by 2030, and then to go for full recovery for the next decades. So with this introduction, I hand over to Tom, who will now talk more about some regulatory evolutions.
Yes, correct. Thank you, Johan. Now that we are all aware of the importance of biodiversity, we are ready to listen to Tom van den Berge from Febelfin to discuss on the impact of the upcoming CSR directive and the new taxonomy. Tom, we are happy to have you in this presentation. I hereby give you the floor.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you for having me. Glad to talk about how biodiversity and natural capital is approached within the financial sector and in sustainable finance legislation. Biodiversity, as Johan already mentioned, is generally regarded as the next big thing in ESG. Previously, the focus was very much on climate change and climate risk, but the impact of biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation is expected to be much larger, as are the resulting risks for the economy and thus also the resulting risks for companies and the financial sector. And then we haven't even talked about the broader social and societal consequences of biodiversity loss. This growing attention is reflected in sustainable finance legislation, which increasingly integrates biodiversity considerations. We'll go into that a little bit more depth later. But let me mention that the integration of biodiversity in financial decision-making is a very complex matter. It is complex. It was complex for climate integration, but for biodiversity, there are additional complexities. On the one hand, quantifying and pricing biodiversity risk is very new terrain. Much has to be explored. Biodiversity has many drivers and components, has diverse specific geographic aspects. The measurement standards, calculation methods are still in very early development. We don't have greenhouse gas protocols or carbon equivalents like we have in climate change assessments. So all these things need to be developed and are under development. In the next 15 minutes, I would like to touch upon a few things. The value of biodiversity, I will go very quick, as Johan has already illustrated that. Then I will go into why that biodiversity is relevant for financial institutions with a focus on the risk aspects. Then I will tackle a few European legislations, the Taxonomy, the SFDR, and the CSRD. And in conclusion, I will mention some non-regulatory initiatives in the financial sector. Next slide, please. Next. So biodiversity, Johan has already mentioned it. There are a lot of ecosystems that have economic and social value. It's estimated 125 trillion US dollars per year, and that's more than 1.5 times the annual global GDP. So any loss or degradation of these services will translate in economic and social loss, and this will impact citizens and companies, and it will of course also impact financial institutions that provide loans, that invest and insure these citizens and companies. Next slide. Not surprisingly, the World Economic Forum has put biodiversity loss in the top 3 of the most severe global risks in the next 10 years. Next slide. Next. When we talk about the importance or materiality of biodiversity loss for companies and for the financial sector, it's important to take 2 different viewpoints into account. On the one hand, we should consider the financial materiality. That means the impact of natural capital or biodiversity loss for financial institutions that finance sectors that are heavily dependent on ecosystem services. So this is the financial materiality. On the other hand, we should also not forget the environmental and social materiality. This materiality, this impact is the impact of supporting and financing certain activities that can have a high negative or positive impact on biodiversity. That means that companies and financial institutions can choose to be selective in financing activities that are positive, that have a positive impact on biodiversity, and maybe be a little bit more selective towards activities that have a negative impact. This viewpoint of double materiality is also reflected in the new EU Sustainable Finance Regulations. Next slide, please. The impact of the activities of financial institutions on biodiversity is mainly indirect. That means that the direct impact of a financial institution on biodiversity is fairly low. The direct operations, the buildings of financial institutions have a fairly limited biodiversity impact. But much larger is the indirect impact, let's say their scope 3 impact. And that is the impact they generate by providing credits, loans, and investments to companies that in their turn can have a very big, very large impact on biodiversity. When financial institutions integrate biodiversity in their risk assessment, they distinguish on the one hand sectors that have a very severe impact, such as agricultural and marine activities. Let's think about overharvesting, soil depletion, deforestation that can lead to erosion, overfishing, pollution of water, use of pesticides, unmanaged animal waste. All these things, mainly in the agriculture and marine sector, can have a very negative impact on biodiversity. Also, the sectors of energy production, mining, Arctic drilling, shale gas, for instance, have a very negative impact. But also urban development, traffic, transportation are sectors with severe impacts. When financial institutions finance these sectors, they take into account certain transitional and also reputational risks. On the other hand, there are also sectors that are severely impacted by a loss of biodiversity. Sometimes they are the same sectors, like for instance, the agriculture sector, who depends heavily on, for instance, fertility of soil and pollination. Fishery, textile sector, also the pharmaceutical sector are heavily dependent on biodiversity. So any loss can have an economic impact on these sectors. So the financing of these sectors poses physical risks for the financial sector, which in turn translate in the usual credit and market risks for banks and asset managers. Next slide, please. If we give some examples of such kinds of risks, for instance, the reduction of soil fertility, a reduction of animal pollination can lead to reduced yield from crops. And this can in turn lead to business defaults or lower financial returns of companies that heavily depend on fertility of soil and animal pollination. And this lower financial return or even default can pose additional risks for the banks that provide loans to these companies or investors that invest in these companies. Also, new legislation, for instance, norms for nitrogen deposition in agriculture or laws on the biodiversity impact of urban development can have an impact on businesses involved in these activities and can pose additional costs, which may lead to lower profits and increased financial risks. Also changing consumer preferences, consumers that tend more towards local, small-scale produce, biofoods. This can have an impact on the business case of more large industrial agriculture companies, which in turn can lead to economic and financial risks. Also, from a reputational angle, banks are very hesitant to get involved in companies that have a highly detrimental impact on nature, for instance, via pollution or deforestation. Think about mining, energy sector, palm oil sector. These sectors are very closely looked at for potential controversies, all to avoid reputational damage for the financial institution. On a very broad scale, we have also systemic risk. For instance, the example of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has links to biodiversity. This is a risk that affects the global economy and not only the financial sector. Next, please. Next slide, please, Kim. Yes, this I will skip. When we go to regulation, I would like to touch on three kinds of regulation. First, the EU taxonomy, then the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, and lastly, the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive. The EU taxonomy, I will not go into too detail what that taxonomy is, but the taxonomy is a classification system that defines which economic activities contribute to an environmental objective. One of the objectives is biodiversity. An economic activity can contribute if it fulfills a few requirements. And these are the technical screening criteria. That means such an activity must substantially contribute to the objective, but on the other hand, also not do any harm to any of the other objectives. Currently, the taxonomy has been finalized in a first version for the objectives of climate change, mitigation and adaptation. but fairly last month, the first draft was published for the other objectives of the taxonomy, among others, about the activities supporting biodiversity. If we go to the next slide, this will give you an example on how biodiversity is integrated in the taxonomy from the angle of do no significant harm. Here you see two activities, afforestation and construction of new buildings. These are two activities that are present in the climate taxonomy. So these two activities can have a substantial contribution to climate change mitigation. But on the other hand, they cannot do significant harm to biodiversity. And here on this slide, it is very small, but you can see the criteria that these activities need to fulfill to not harm biodiversity. For instance, construction of new building can be a contributing activity if there is an environmental impact assessment and if the new construction, the new building is not built on land that is valuable for biodiversity. And so for more than 90 different activities, there are mostly fairly similar do not significant harm criteria with regards to biodiversity. Next slide, please. If you look at it from the other angle, are there activities that contribute, that have a positive impact to biodiversity? And this is fairly new. The proposal was published the 30th of March, so this is not a law yet. This is the very first proposal. And in that proposal, we see that there are 3 activities identified that can have a positive impact on biodiversity. Activities regarding animal production, crop production, and fishing. If these activities comply with a number of positive impact criteria, they can be considered as a contributing activity towards biodiversity. What is the importance of being considered a contributing activity? That means that you will be, you could become eligible for specific financing instruments, and you will become, as a company that provides these kind of activities, you will become more attractive for banks and for investors. But this is still very much under development. Next slide, please. A second legislation is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations, or the SFDR. This is a regulation that requires that investment firms and investment products disclose to what degree their investments negatively impact biodiversity. So what are the negative impacts of their investment portfolios? They need to do that annually in their annual reports. And they have to include a statement on principal adverse impacts. And these principal adverse impacts are very broad. There are a lot of themes that have to do with climate change, but also with human rights and other issues. But there are also a number of issues regarding biodiversity. For instance, they have to disclose the share of their investments, their companies they invest in, that have operations in biodiversity sensitive areas, or that have activities that cause land degradation, or that whose operations affect threatened species. So a lot of disclosures about the potential adverse impacts of the investments. And to conclude, the next slide, the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive, the CSRD. This is also still a proposal. This is not yet finalized. This directive will require that all large companies, so not only financial companies, but all companies, disclose about their environmental performance, about their environmental impact, including information about biodiversity and ecosystems. This disclosure needs to be done using a harmonized reporting template. These reporting templates are currently being drafted by a specialized European agency, the EFRAG. And last month, also very new, the first draft reporting standard, E4, was published regarding biodiversity and ecosystems. And what do companies need to disclose? They need to disclose about their biodiversity impact on three levels: strategy, governance, impact risks, the policies, and some performance measurements, some KPIs. On the next slide, you see that in a little bit more detail. So in these 5 pillars, companies need to disclose about their transition plans regarding the bending of the curve by 2030, about their resilience of their business model against biodiversity related risks, about how they engage with stakeholders, about their impact and dependency analysis, whether they have specific policies, targets, and actions that they take. And they also have to provide information on a range of performance metrics. And then to conclude on the last slide, we have some voluntary initiatives, but Johan will go into that a little bit further in the next session. We have Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, Nature Action 100. Very important is the Partnership for Biodiversity Accounting for Financials, which tries to make tries to provide financial institutions with practical guidance how to measure biodiversity impact, which is a big challenge. And that's it for me, I think. I give the floor to Johan, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tom. Yeah, I will immediately go on, Kim, if that's fine for you.
Yes, perfect. We are a bit short in time, so you can.
Yeah, okay. I will try to make that good. So I will give you some insights in the complexity, indeed, of measuring quantification of biodiversity. But yeah, I like very much this statement of the CEO of Natura, which is a Brazilian cosmetics company. We need to track our impact on the climate and nature with the same discipline we track our profit and loss. So it's a shift of mind that we need to make, but it will be very necessary to do that. Next slide, Kim. Of course, to do that, you need to know how to measure biodiversity. This is indeed not an easy thing. Many companies, financial institutions are struggling with, okay, which metrics, which tools, which pressures do I need to take into account, and so on, and so on, and so on. So there are multiple questions. Next slide. And this is where we, together with the work that we do for the EU Business and Biodiversity platform, so we have published now already three times assessment reports on available biodiversity measurement approaches for businesses and financial institutions, where we compare these approaches in terms of their limits, in terms of their strengths. And this has resulted now, so all this information you can find on the website of the EU Business and Biodiversity platform. It's very easy to find if you look under the work streams session. Next slide, Kim. In the latest report, and we will update it, but this is an extract of the latest report, where we have this matrix with an overview of the different biodiversity measurement tools. So we are very much aware that there are there are now quite a number of tools available, but for a company or a financial institution, it's very confusing. It's very difficult to select the right one. So this matrix provides part of the answer. It shows how each of these tools fits well to a certain combination of what we call an organizational focus area, which is product level, site level, corporate level, and so on. For financial companies, portfolio level. And then also depending on the type of the decisions that you want to make with the measurement results. If you want to compare several options, if you only want to screen risks and so on, if you want to measure current performance, future performance, track progress against targets and so on, these are all different applications. And you see that, in fact, in this landscape of tools, tools are covering a specific combination of these two entrances, in fact. Now we are updating this because this is all very much an evolution. We have also investigated a number of case studies in pink colors here indicated in the table. Yes, Kim, next slide. So these case studies are really in-depth case studies explaining how methodologies are have been applied to a concrete case. Some of them in this list are also applied to or by a financial institution, for instance, the GBS Biodiversity Impact Analysis with Carbon for Finance, number 13. We have the BFFI somewhere, number 8, which is the Biodiversity Footprint for Financial Institutions. So you can find a number of quality reviewed case studies. Next slide. In the latest report, we also have worked on a navigation wheel, so allowing companies to select a suitable measurement tool based on a number of criteria, like the 2 criteria I just mentioned, but also which measures you want to measure. For instance, is it the impact due to greenhouse gases? Is it the impact due to land use change? Is it both? Is it more than those 2? And so on. The level of efforts that you need to do, the type of metric that you want to select, and so on. But it's all very well explained in the accompanying guidance. Next slide. Yes, I really want to recommend you to have a look to the website of the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge. So a second work stream of the Business and Biodiversity platform is dedicated to the finance sector. And as a result of that, the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge and the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation were born a few years ago. They are building further on the work we have done on measuring tools and assessing measuring tools. And for instance, they have published a very good guidance on biodiversity measurement approaches for the financial sector. So you see which tools, and on the right here of this slide, you see which tools have been assessed. And if you go to the next slide, Kim, they have also presented it in nice diagrams. So mentioning again the same criteria as I just showed you on the navigation wheel, but for these more finance sector related tools. It doesn't mean that all these tools are only applicable by the finance sector, but these are definitely suitable tools for the finance sector. And you see for each of them, you have an idea about the number of times the tool has been applied for specific combinations, which gives an idea about the maturity level of the tool. And this goes on the next slide. So it's a pretty important table with a lot of information. Yes, next slide. They also provide an overview of biodiversity initiatives for financial institutions. Building a bit further on what Tom just has presented, you see that there is quite a lot already these days in terms of biodiversity initiatives for financial institutions. And here they are ranked according to the type of topic that they are dealing with. For instance, is it only with ESG and engagement processes, or is it about measurement and data? Is it about target setting? Is it about reporting and disclosure, and so on? So there's really a lot these days to digest. And one of these examples, and was also mentioned by Tom, is PBAF. Next slide. PBAF is the Partnership for Biodiversity Accounting Financials, who are developing a specific standard for financial institutions on how to measure biodiversity. It's a little bit focused at this moment very much to the BFFI, the Biodiversity Footprint for Financial Institutions, because the tool developers of this tool are also the people behind PBAF. But their intention is to broaden it to all the tools which are available. Next slide. Yes, just to complete, Arcadis has also done some work for GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network. So together with WWF, the Netherlands, we have developed metrics for impact investors. So biodiversity metrics for impact investors, which are now included in their IRIS Plus software. So maybe that's familiar to some of you. IRIS Plus software provides metrics for all kinds of societal and environmental topics which are important for impact investors. Yes, next slide. Now, what can companies do? So companies, they can, and that's also important for financial institutions to be aware of. Companies, when they start, they can develop, first of all, an ambition. What do they want? Do they want to go for no net loss, for instance, or do they want to go for science-based targets? Or so it's good to have an ambition. You can also have workshops around it to decide which ambition you want to have, and so on. Then identifying material biodiversity issues is, of course, very important to do this along the whole value chain. You can define priorities. You need to select your measurement approaches. You need to take action, and of course you should also engage with stakeholders and so on. Now a few examples to finish this presentation of how Arcadis has supported some of her clients. For instance, for Alvonzi, we have developed, we have applied our own tool, which is the Biodiversity Net Gain Calculator, which is really a site level tool measuring the green areas at a site, a company's site, attributing a condition and an extent indicator to each of these green spots. And then together with the company, compile an action plan on how to improve biodiversity value on these green areas. And this allows you to measure your progress over time in terms of how you have improved your biodiversity values at the site. This is interesting also from the viewpoint of offsets, and this may be the next slide, Kim, where we did something similar for Allpro. And Allpro has set an ambition that they wanted to be zero net loss by 2030. So again, for their sites, we measured the possibilities at site level. But of course, at site level, you can never compensate your biodiversity impacts by only improving biodiversity values at the green spots at your site, because the majority of the area is building area, is built area. So there is a need to look for offsets. Offsets means restoring nature outside the fence of your area. Of course, after you have applied all potential mitigation actions and reduction actions that you can take at the site level. And we, together with Natuurpunt, so Arcadis has an agreement with Natuurpunt that together we look for suitable offset sites, and we measure and we calculate and we estimate the potential biodiversity gains that you can achieve there. And so comparing the losses and the gains allows you to have a good insight in the distance to target if you want to be no net loss by 2030, for instance. Next slide is yeah, for Spadel again. Spadel, they also decided to go for science-based targets this time. They also wanted to be no net loss by 2030, but they already did a lot in the past. So we came up with an approach to measure already their results in the past, and they are now working very hard to further improve biodiversity. They recently won the Belgian Business and Biodiversity Award, which was granted for the very first time. We had the Royals, the Belgian Royals, visited their sites and have a good discussion on biodiversity. So Spadel is another company doing very well. And maybe one other example, Kim, if you go further, yes, this one, where for an energy client was also willing to go for a biodiversity net positive impact for all their new renewable assets, for instance, wind farms, but also solar farms by 2025. And they also want to know the budget which is required for implementing a no net loss policy, because restoration efforts and offsets requires money. And this has very rarely been calculated until now. And so we are doing this type of exercises for those companies. I leave it here because we really should take some time for answering some of your questions, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed both presentations today, so I hope the audience did too. For everyone in the audience, we still have the speakers in this presentation until 2 p.m. So feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box on the right side of your screen. In the meantime, we already received some questions. I see that Tom was also already actively answering the questions in the Q&A, but I will go over them because I don't think everyone can see them. Maybe Johan, first a question for you. Let me check. Who needs to lead, or who can we expect to lead in bending the curve? Finance sector, business, authorities, who can do most?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And yeah, there have been several discussions around that recently. And one would think that the government, the public sector or authorities should take the lead. And it's also expected that they take the lead. But what you see in reality is that business communities and financial sector communities are now taking over from the authorities, and they are now taking the lead even. So you all know that we should have the CBD next conference in China, which has been postponed a few times now already. And there is the Business for Nature initiative, for instance, which is a bottom-up initiative by businesses. You can look it up at the internet, Business for Nature, and they are really pushing for a very ambitious agenda at the CBD, and they have difficulties to raise the bar sufficiently high. And so we are now in a very strange situation that we have businesses pushing for more ambitious targets than many governments at this moment. But the answer is all stakeholders, of course, should have a role to play there, and they should preferably do it in a joint action.
Okay, thank you. One more question for you. Which companies are leading the way around biodiversity protection on a proactive basis? Can you give some examples?
Yeah, in terms of, well, I can, yeah, I don't know if it's the intention to name companies individually, but in terms of sectors, I can say that, for instance, the mining and extraction sector, because of course they also are facing a serious reputational risk already for a very long time, because their impact is very obvious. They make a hole in the ground and they destroy nature, they are now already very advanced in their thinking because they are restoring nature, and they often do it in a very good way. I don't say that every mining company is doing that, but there are many in the sector that are really very active and really producing even higher value nature than before. There are, of course, front-runner companies, and we often have the tendency to look only at the front-runners and to think that, okay, they are doing very well, and then we imagine that the others are following. But this is often a false image. The reality is that the far majority of the companies and also financial institutions these days is still lagging behind. Also SMEs, it's not easy for SMEs to cope with an issue like biodiversity, but there are very important and simple actions that every company can take. So there is, yeah. Okay. But I named a few companies in the presentation, but there are of course many more.
Okay.
If there is a good example that I can name, Kering is a famous one. It's the French luxury company who has a very interesting website also with a specific approach, the environmental profit and loss approach. But there are many more.
Okay, thank you. Now let's go to Tom for a couple of questions. So Tom, I see you answered already, but because the other participants cannot see your answers, let's go over them one more time. So does the taxonomy define what is considered significant?
Certainly. The taxonomy is a work in progress, but currently the first part of taxonomy that treats activities that contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation is already a book of more than 600 pages of very detailed technical criteria. So each activity needs to fulfill quite a number of very detailed criteria to be considered contributing, and the same set, a similar set of criteria will also be proposed for the other environmental objectives, among others, biodiversity.
Okay, there was another question for you. What is your interpretation of the EU taxonomy when a company covers several activities indicated in the criteria?
The taxonomy is sets criteria on the level of an economic activity. There is the taxonomy does not stipulate or not define when a company is environmental or green or supports biodiversity. It is not on the level of the company, it's on the level of a specific activity, and a company can have many activities. Some of these activities can be aligned with the criteria of the taxonomy, and other activities of that same company can be not aligned with the taxonomy. This is of course not a problem. It is inherent in the current economy. I don't think there are many companies that are 100% taxonomy aligned. But what these companies need to do is that they need to disclose the percentage of the taxonomy alignment of their activities. And that means the percentage of their revenue and the percentage of their investments that they derive or dedicate to taxonomy activities.
Okay, thank you. One final question before we end this webinar. Would you say that companies that report according to the CSR directive requirements automatically also meet TNFD disclosure recommendations? If not, what is the gap according to your expertise?
That will be the intention. The CSRD is very much looks very carefully at the TNFD. It was the case for the TCFD, so the climate and the climate financial disclosure task force, which was inspirational for the CSRD, and so the TNFD will also be inspirational for the CSRD requirements. But CSRD goes further. TNFD only looks at the financial materiality, the financial risks of biodiversity loss, while the CSRD also takes the other viewpoint, be it the negative or positive impact of financial decisions on biodiversity. So that double materiality is in the CSRD, but is not in the TNFD.
Okay, thank you very much. We do not have additional questions. Johan, I don't know if you want to add something, or Tom as well. Otherwise, I propose that we finalize the meeting here. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone. I hope this was very interesting for you. We will share the slides after this meeting, because it was also a question of one of you. Normally, we will also publish the recording of this session, so you can look at the slides, and of course, if there are any questions left, you can find the contact information on this final slide, and please don't hesitate to ask the questions to both speakers, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.